Welcome to the sixth and final COVID Conversations webinar organised by KCLA, King's College London Alumni Association to celebrate its 100 years. This has been a fascinating and insightful series exploring how COVID-19 has impacted different areas of life. And for the most part, we've focused on the UK hitherto. But today, well, of course, COVID-19 has been a global pandemic, so today's webinar is going to add an international perspective with our two speakers exploring the impact of COVID-19 on the developing world. We have Professor Funmi Olonisakin, who is King's Vice President and Vice Principal International and holds the Chair of Security, Leadership and Development at King's. She will speak first. And then we have Dr. Vinicius Carvalho, who's director of the King's Brazil Institute, and also contributes to the work of my old department of War Studies. And actually, Funmi has a PhD from the same department, so War Studies is well represented today. Funmi is going to speak first. Funmi has, in addition to her role at King's, she's also a research associate with the Department of Political Sciences in Pretoria, and she was appointed a Mellon Foundation Distinguished Scholar on Peace and Conflict. Her PhD, as I said, was Department of War Studies at King's. She was a founding member of the African Leadership Centre, which aims to build the next generation of African scholars, generating cutting-edge knowledge of the security and development of Africa. In 2015, she was appointed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as one of the 7 members of the advisory group of experts on the review of UN peacekeeping architecture. Her research interests are very wide-ranging and include leadership perspectives in security and development, youth, peace and security in developing societies, the emerging African paradigm, and future peace through the lens of future people. She's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes on Africa in a global context of COVID-19. Over to you, Funmi, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you so very much. Eminent Chair, and thank you so much, Diana. Wonderful to see you and to see that we share history with War Studies at King's. My co-conspirator, Vinicius de Carvalho, my colleague and friend, distinguished colleagues, fellow members of the King's College London Alumni Association. Good evening, everyone. I'm so pleased and grateful for the privilege of speaking to this topic and to this particular audience as well, for a whole range of reasons, particularly as this is part of our centenary events. I should say that the impact of COVID-19 in the developing world is varied. It's varied by region, by issues, if you like, peoples and governance. And therefore it throws up such complexity with local, national, and regional implications. And interestingly, when you really look at this, there's a historical dimension to today, which is why to this question today, which is why I said I was really pleased to be speaking about this subject. And so what I want to do for the next 15 or so minutes is to speak in headline form about this impact from the perspectives, not just within Africa, but looking at this in a global context. And that historical fact is this. This time 100 years ago, when our Alumni Association was being established, as it were, Africa was only just recovering, or trying to recover actually, from the devastating impact of the Spanish flu. Port cities were the most affected. And we have revisited literature in the past few months to see that in Nigeria and in South Africa, the devastation was just really unbelievable. People had walked into the port city of Lagos when they suddenly realized that people had died, even already they were sick on the ship, and they just mingled with society, and it was just real calamity. The same thing in South Africa. You had soldiers who were returning from the First World War, and they had come out of the port, come out of the and got on the trains and mingled in South Africa. More than 300,000 people were recorded dead in South Africa at the time. So it's not surprising that following the outbreak of COVID-19, the world predicted the worst impacts in the developing world, particularly in Africa. And much of it had to do with state capacity. Where were the hospitals, the nurses, the doctors? How were they going to cope? In the UK, we're talking about avoiding a situation where the NHS will be overrun by the sheer numbers of sick people. The Olympics were postponed, even when this conversation was happening about perhaps not postponing the Olympics. All a few people had to consider was the sheer, tragedy of the impact of COVID-19 in Africa. And today, 10 months or so later, the opposite has been the case. We have had almost 1.9 million cases recorded in Africa, about 45,000 deaths. But let's just face it, there's limited testing that's taking place. The data cannot be that accurate because different countries, even within a particular country, different regions or states might be recording, might be testing or not even recording. What we thought were going to be the predictive factors initially was the sheer numbers of people dying, as we saw in Kano State in Nigeria. But this has also not been the case. We've had explanations of the youth bulge, and we know that Africa is the only region at the moment that continues to grow, and its population will continue to grow until around 2050. Its population will double, and as a matter of fact, those who will double that population, most of them are already born. They've already been born. So with an average age of 19.5 years, it's a strong case that is being made that many young people are able to overcome COVID easily, but it tells us that we have a lot of asymptomatic carriers in Africa. We don't know nearly enough. But let me move quickly to the issues. I just want to speak in headline form to many of these points, and then we can take them on later. We've already talked a little bit about health, but the theme of inequality is something that doesn't just apply to Africa, but globally. We have seen how COVID has really underscored the underlying inequalities in society across the board. But let me take a couple of areas. Education, for example, we've seen how access to education is one thing that we have seen. Poor children just simply would not go to school, period. No electricity, no access to data, to anything. The wealthier kids would be able to operate from their laptops, iPad, and so on. But what has happened is almost across the board, at least in some of the bigger countries, and I speak of Nigeria, I speak of South Africa, where you see, even Kenya as well, where you see partnerships between the private sector, like telephone companies and universities. Sometimes governments, state governments, and so on, have stepped in to try to provide the resources. We have seen creativity where in the darkest villages with irregular access to electricity or to any kind of telephone network, we've seen how solar phones are being given to teachers, even to students, with curriculum already embedded in it, with free data from the telephone company. So there's a lot of innovation going on. And I think that's one positive dimension of COVID, the access, the technological divide, and we're beginning to see how even teaching students via the radio, which is what every household in many African countries would have, might have the radio and listen to the BBC Africa service once a day and so on. That becomes another instrument to try to reach people. Let me talk about governance and societal mobilization. My goodness, this is one area where globally we begin to see the kinds of inequalities, the ways in which many African countries in some instances simply mirrored what was going on in the Western world and tried to lock down and locking down communities of people who actually cannot earn a living unless they go out of their homes. They will be on the streets every day. Those who understand Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, you know that you see these teeming people, population on the streets, looking for work. If you have Kenyans here listening, your Juakali workers, they have to work under the sun and earn their living. You don't work, you don't get paid, period. You don't get to eat. So under lockdown, giving you palliatives, as they would call it in Nigeria, or supporting you with those packages in different ways in Kenya, in South Africa, just will not cut it, because how much can you give to a family of 6, 7 to feed? Virtually impossible. So people at some point in time said they felt equally threatened by hunger as they felt by COVID. And they had a choice, stay home and die or go out on the streets and die, unfortunately, because in some cases, in some instances, the use of force, the threat of force was what was being used to compel people to stay home. So the point is, the class inequalities are great. This has been laid bare. And the governance systems, the approach to it showed, in some cases, very weak leadership infrastructure, so that the hardware of governance on a day-to-day basis, there was no capacity to respond to the real needs of people that needed a different approach to tackle COVID. So we've seen just how this has, broken down in some places, and people are now very much on the streets, but we're in an environment where people think, where we've overcome COVID in Africa. I want to suggest not. There's a lot more that is happening. But on this question of governance, this is where some African countries have fared much better, notwithstanding weak leadership infrastructure. They have fared much better than some Western countries. We have seen part of that is trust in society. So even where you didn't have trust in government, you had trust across society because of previous history of responding to pandemics or epidemics. We saw it with Ebola. If HIV, AIDS was different, but Africa has been rattled by many of these diseases in the past couple of decades. So people had a natural fear for this unknown and unprecedented virus that had come into their midst. And you saw how communities banded together. So the leadership infrastructure that might be missing from the level of the state was very much present across society in many cases. So the support, and sometimes you'd think, oh, it's about churches or mosques and so on. Even that is nuanced this time, because the same religious institutions that had been the go-to places before also did not know how to respond to this. So we're seeing innovations across African societies, and we've tried to capture various dimensions of this in the research at the African Leadership Center. All of those will need to be studied and unearthed. But when you look across the board, populist states have not done well. And it's not about the more democratic or the more autocratic leaders. It's just that when you've had populist nations, they haven't done well. In the case of African countries, though, countries that seem to have had histories of liberation movements seem to have handled the immediate emergencies better. There's a lot to be studied, but we saw countries like Senegal, Ghana, that rallied around, South Africa. So there are many examples to speak of there. As I start to close, I want to make sense of the global governance environment. If we have seen different degrees of successes as far as societal mobilization is concerned globally, and we have seen interesting examples or results from the African continent, the infrastructure, the leadership infrastructure at the level of at the level of global governance is what has been most worrying, apart from the World Health Organization, which has been the central institution responding to this. And we have seen some of the challenges and the relationship between the big powers. The UN Security Council has been found wanting in terms of attention to rally the world and convene the world around all of this. That's something we're going to have to study. The relationship between these global institutions and African countries will be very interesting to look at, because when you look at international development now, It's not automatic anymore that countries in Europe and North America that are recovering from COVID-19 are going to be responding in the same way to development challenges in Africa. I want to suggest that this is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe for the first time, you begin to see African societies responding to their own situations, to their own challenges without waiting. There will have to be a new kind of development arrangement, global development and international development arrangement that will unfold. What I find most, the penultimate point I want to make is around the global economy. I think there will be contestation. Why? Because we have seen the response to Africa being around the generation of raw materials from Africa to boost economies globally at different points in time. Whether you're talking about the East Asian economies, they've relied on raw materials from Africa. China is doing the same at the moment. And therefore, the absence of industrialization means that we cannot really, when you think about it, apart from this very limited manufacturing to speak of in Africa, very under 20% of it. The bulk of it is around mining, natural resource, mining of natural resources, oil, and so on. There will have to be serious conversations because African communities and societies are going to think differently with a new generation of people, 1.2 billion approximately Africans, young people that have seen how their governments have responded, that have rallied round across the societies to respond to COVID-19, are beginning to ask questions of their governments. And we will see that in various protests, not the direct use of force or violence that we have seen in previous years at the beginning of the 21st century with the civil wars, but real contestation. And therefore, we will have a new generation of leaders that would emerge from this entire experience. They will ask questions of the rest of the world about the kinds of economies, the kind of leadership infrastructure that will exist in their countries. It will cause all of us to ask serious questions about the way to go. And I don't think this is what we thought what we were thinking at the outbreak of COVID. Everyone was worried that Africa will be devastated. We have seen an Africa emerge that has not been devastated by COVID, but an Africa that is going to experience some tensions because of relationships, intergenerational relationships, massive numbers of unemployed youth, education systems in which there's been a history of inequalities. And we will need to respond to the demands of a new generation of young people that might take to the streets, social media, different spaces to ask their governments to do better. So Africa is a region to be watched for the time being. I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you very much, Funmi. What an interesting and exciting note to finish on with looking forward to real change in Africa. So COVID-19 is an opportunity for change. I'm now going to turn to Dr. Vinicius Carvalho, who's director of the King's Brazil Institute, and as I said before, also contributes to the work of my old department, the Department of War Studies. I think, Vinicius, can you put on your video?
I am not authorized to put my video on.
Are you not? Right.
Yeah.
Start video.
Okay, that is fine.
Okay. Okay, Vinicius, having first studied in Brazil, he then served in the Brazilian army, received his PhD in Germany, and then was director of the Latin American Center at the University of Aarhus in Denmark, so is well traveled with his research. His research is wide-ranging across Brazilian studies, but has a particular focus on the role of the Brazilian armed forces. But parallel to his academic career, Vinicius is also a music conductor and directs the King's Brazil Ensemble, which I look forward to hearing at an appropriate time in the future. He's also a founding fellow of the King's Academy and senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. And Vinicius is going to talk to us about COVID-19 in Brazil in a global context. So over to you, Vinicius.
Thank you very much. It would be a pleasure. Sorry, it would be a pleasure to start this presentation with some music for you too, but unfortunately we cannot perform publicly now, and we need to wait for the next time that we can do some music performance. I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you and to be part of this large debate that you are promoting on the aspects of COVID, globally speaking. It's a great honor to be here, and especially to talk after Funmi, a person who, as she said, we conspire a lot together and work very well together also. I will be looking more to the other part of the Atlantic, to the South Atlantic, to Brazil and South America, trying to give a more broad look on what is going on and what is the impacts of COVID for those societies. Well, let's start a little bit with some contexts here, in the case of Brazil and Latin America. The first point to call the attention is that the region was extremely, as you all know, extremely affected by the COVID. Only Brazil has over 5 million people with the contamination of the COVID, was one of the biggest numbers of people dying because of COVID also. The entire subcontinent of South America and Latin America in general contributes to the immense number of cases. Well, the first point to call the attention here is that COVID came to a region that was known because of inequalities. And as a consequence of that, one of the main aspects that we should highlight here is how much COVID is also reinforcing these inequalities in several aspects. One of them is inequalities in race and gender. We can see that in the spectrum of the region, all this the typical gender inequality that these countries, and Brazil specifically, but the entire Latin America, suffered historically, has been highlighted because of COVID. The increasing number of violence against women, feminicide, that had been, at least in previous years before COVID, been addressed more responsibly and more seriously and objectively by states, they grew again, as well as the questions about race, ethnic background inequality. In the case of Brazil, for instance, indigenous communities were extremely affected by the COVID. Communities that were still living there, still living in the Amazonian jungle, for instance, very susceptible to many of the illness or diseases that are carried from people living in the cities in Brazil. So these communities were extremely affected, and not only in Brazil, but as I said, in the entire region. Afro-descendants in Brazil have been extremely victimized because of COVID also, or by COVID, especially those living in communities in slums in big cities like Rio, São Paulo, Recife, where the community of Afro-descendants have less, and historically have been like that, less access to sanitation or health care. So as I said, the COVID actually reinforced the inequalities that were present in those societies, or are present in the societies historically. There is also a question of countryside and urban communities. Despite being less affected in numbers, countryside was very affected because of lack of medical care and treatment, what we can have more in the cities. So what I'm saying here is that this dimension of inequalities that have been historically present in countries of Latin America and Brazil, they start to gain another dimension, multiplication of dimension in this sense. Other issues that were quite important to be noticed here is the aspect of education, as Funmi noticed and told about the African context. In the case of Brazil, when we have a massive young community, a group of people going to schools, that was stopped in the first lockdown in the country. That provoked what will be a serious consequence in long term, because these people that normally go to school and have that as an opportunity even to have their food, their everyday food, they were prevented from this possibility. And the consequence that we will have on that will be, again, the reinforcement of a traditional gap that those with better economical conditions will have better education and consequently reinforce again the inequalities that are present there. Then let's move to the other aspect of the COVID crisis in Brazil and Latin America, to the response, the government response for that. Well, then we are talking here about a very complicated issue that it's very difficult to explain for those who are not familiar with the ways that politics is managed in Latin American context. Well, the first point to highlight is the denial. The first response of governments in the case of Brazil is quite remarkable. Brazilians authorities start to see what was going on in Europe, the increasing of numbers of cases, the lockdowns happening in Italy and Spain, the saturation of the medical services and capacity to respond to that, and not attitudes were taken in Brazil. So they were like a sort of denial that the virus would arrive in Brazil in the same impact that it have happened in Europe. That made, with that response or even the prevention, took a long time to be in place. That exposed much more the huge population to the contamination. So Brazil didn't learn the lessons of what was going on in Europe, didn't take the time when the cases were growing here, but not so much there, to prepare the country to a better response and to prepare the country actually to prevent the increasing of cases. Together with that, our response to the COVID crisis came together with extreme ideologization. I think that's the way to say this word, of the response. So basically, it was almost saying that those who support the government today would think that any sort of response was not a response against the COVID, but much more a reaction against the government. So this ideologization of the response provoked a delay on actions like using of masks, social distancing, and etc. Because, well, if you defended that, actually you were against the government, and the government was saying that no, that's not important, you should not worry about that because we are not like in Europe today. That together with a huge misinformation through social media, through actually also actors of the government that didn't respond properly in a very strategic way to communicate the issues of COVID. So misinformation was everywhere, circulating in WhatsApp groups, in Facebook, misleading the population on how to deal with the cases of COVID. There was another issue in Brazil. Brazil is a federation like the US, and the federal government has no authority to impose rules to the entire country. Each state of the federation can decide in many issues, including public health. So this multiplicity of responses caused a huge confusion in the country. And then we had states like the Amazonian state with an impressive number of cases and deaths, and other states with less. But the circulation of people was still going on. And then that helped to spread the virus very quickly all over the country. So this situation drive us to think about what was the problem, of the main problem with the response to the COVID in Brazil. And I think, and we can again extend to Latin America. I think the aspect of leadership, it's a very important aspect here. A lack of a clear leadership that would take into consideration what science was saying and what science could instruct the population in order to prevent the spread of the virus or the aggravation of the cases there. This lack of leadership capacity to create a track, a national track, or even federal, in the states, tracks that would support and help the response to the COVID crisis. Well, what I'm saying here is that, just to give an example, during the first 6 months of COVID pandemic in Brazil, we had 3 ministers of health that have been fired. One because defend masks and self-isolation and lockdown, and the president was against that, so he was fired. The other one because the president said that people should use hydrochloroquine to treat COVID. And this minister said, no, that's not exactly what science is saying. So he was fired then. And then the government put a military in this position. So that's an important point to look at here. Again, in a very traditional history of Latin America, critical moments are the military called to respond to it or to address the issue. Perhaps due to their logistic capabilities, perhaps due to the way of working of military with very specific and clear chains of command. But even with that, COVID was not properly addressed in Brazil. So the role of the leaders played a very important role here in reinforce these inequalities. And more than that, in this reinforcement of these inequalities that were present there, to create a system that in the end of this pandemic, we will have a very serious issue to respond, is to try to re-encapsulate and promote more equality in a region that has been historically known because of these social differences, the economic differences. The economic measures, especially the lockdown, cause a huge impact in Brazilian economy as all over the world. But if we look at a situation of countries in the region, Brazil, it's again the biggest example, I would say, because of the dimensions of the country. But the informality among the workers, many people that depending on going to the streets to sell their stuff or to clean houses or cars, this informal labor market was definitely and completely affected. They could not receive the same support that those that were formally employed received from the government. So again, we create here a big void that I would say we create a fracture over a fissure. We had a fissure in the societies, and then they became a fracture due to this situation that the pandemic brought to us. So together with that, we should never forget that the pandemic was not the single and only problem in the region at this time. We are talking about a year in which Amazonian jungle, Amazonian rainforest, had the highest numbers of deforestation and fires. So this is add another dramatical element for the pandemic crisis, because that also helps to spread the virus more quickly among the region and provokes a lot of eviction of local indigenous population. We have political turmoil in many countries in the region. Just this week, the Peruvian president, Peru, that's today is the fifth in Latin America with the highest numbers of cases, almost 1 million now. Peruvian president was impeached this week. And it's the second time that they tried to impeach during the pandemic. So in Guatemala, we had a hurricane that provoked flooding in many parts of the country, also increasing again the inequalities that were already present there. In Chile, we had street protests for months to call for new elections and the referendum to vote for a new constitution in the country. So this social protests that come together, and of course doesn't help with social distance here. In the case of Argentina, we had already a country that was in economic bankruptcy before the pandemic, and surely when the pandemic arrives there, and today is the second in Latin America in the number of cases, 1.2 million cases, I think. So Mexican, we had the new president coming with also a behavior of denial of COVID. And now Mexico sees this increasing number of cases because, again, lack of leadership. I should not finish without address the issue of corruption. Countries that have been in recent years, especially the case of Brazil, on the spot because of corruption schemes like Lava Jato, the car wash operation that revealed how much construction companies in contracts with the state have been a fantastic, immense and giant project of corruption, state corruption, basically, this looking at the corruption and addressing and tackling corruption in the political arena has been reduced because of the Covid, creating space for, again, these mechanisms regain space to operate inside the political structures. Case of Rio de Janeiro state, contracts for building up campaign hospitals were issued, millionary contracts to build up 9 hospitals.
Last minute, Vinicius.
I'm coming to the end in this last minute, and only 1 hospital was built up during this period. So I will conclude here. Unfortunately, the picture is not beautiful for Latin America. And yes, as Funmi said, the new generations, they will be asking for solutions and they will put in pressure for change here. And that's what we expect also, as Funmi said, for Africa, we would expect for Latin America and Brazil. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks again for giving me the opportunity to share with you these ideas.
Thank you, Vinicius. Okay, it's now time for questions. I'm going to bring Funmi back on, I think, or Barry, can I leave you to do that while I sort out some questions? Bloody hell. Yep. So what a depressing picture you painted of South America, Vinicius. That was fairly almost a perfect storm across the whole of the South American continent. I have a question for you. Did any country in South America perform well through COVID-19? And for Funmi, I wondered whether you could actually highlight for us whether there were any countries that some really good practice in leadership in some of the African countries. So Vinicius, you first.
Yes, that's a good question. And indeed, some countries did good job in the beginning. And I would say even Guatemala, for instance, when they have a very early lockdown, they made the country really well protected for quite a long time, as maximum as was possible. But again, in a country in which inequality is already there in huge numbers, and victim of hurricanes and many other natural disasters that reduce the capacity of local population to even feed their own children, then we can see that a more comprehensive, a more holistic response would be necessary than just the pragmatic way of lockdown and trying to prevent the spread of the virus. No? But unfortunately, no.
Thank you. Funmi?
Yes, no, interesting. I mean, of course, it's a mixed bag. 54 or 55 countries and counting. You saw 2 kinds of performance. One was one in which the state responded with the, leaders responded with the right messages, rallied people to the cause. Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa stands out, not only for a leader that had been dealing with issues within the party, questions of corruption, back and forth with, just dealing with internal, if you like, challenges. He rose, he was very presidential. He was able to rally people with the right messages. And in leadership terms, it's about building mutuality between leaders and people, that we're in this together. This is a common cause, and to be convincing in that way as well. So I think in all of those early phases, Cyril was able to provide that kind of leadership within South Africa. Unfortunately, when Vinicius was talking about existing structures, whether in South Africa or Nigeria and several other places, you could see that existing leadership infrastructure that used, if you like, the military, where the military saw its role, or shall I say the security establishment, because in some cases it was not necessarily the army, but you had a police service that saw coercive force, coercive power as what, the basis of its relationship with the people. So you were seeing places where people were forcefully locked down. And this, that kind of abuse was difficult. And then across all the Senegal, I have to say that Senegal performed very, very well. Strong record. Locked down in good time, got, mobilized, the real societal mobilization around the issue, even began to research testing, was doing its own testing at some point. Now, don't ask me what the degree of accuracy of any of this was, but the fact that every effort was made to get to grip with the science around this and try to get the locals affordable testing regimes and so on. I think Senegal was very impressive. Countries, the reason why this was checkered across the board, I just want to underscore the gender aspect of it. And I think many, if not all African countries failed in this regard. I'm not saying that Africa, this is a preserve of Africa. But in Kenya, for example, at least they managed to bring out the records. But that was also the case with domestic violence and gender-based violence across the countries, Nigeria too. But what the phenomenon in Kenya, in which within 4 or so months of COVID, you started to see secondary school girls who had been locked down, pregnant. In one county, there were 4,000 pregnant girls within a short period of time. In another county, about 11,000 girls who were supposedly, to be protected at home. Suddenly you saw this, and it ranged between, violence or coercion or, transactional relationships that generated that. Those were not protected citizens. And that is an area, that's a major gap. And there's a gender inequality there that those states did not even try, to anticipate. That's a very, very big, I should have mentioned that in my presentation. So I would say that the successes in terms of dealing with COVID, they were checkered. And what I meant about former liberation leaders being more successful sometimes. Initially, you saw Museveni and how he was rallying people. I believe there's a psyche that remains of the ways in which they dealt with the liberation, that they acted as liberation movements. That kicks in during a time of national emergency. That itself does not necessarily suggest effective leadership across the board.
Thank you. I've got several questions about leadership and governance across Africa and Latin America. I think to some extent you've both answered those, but both of you touched on cultural backgrounds. Vinicius, you mentioned different isolated groups and indigenous populations, and Funmi, you've talked about several groups, but both of you talked about how communities could have different leadership and pull together. We have a question here about how much the culture in different areas affected the response. Would you both like to comment on that, the different cultural backgrounds?
Absolutely. And I don't know so much whether it's a cultural background as much as there's a religious dimension to what I've observed in Africa. And the cultural backgrounds, even within countries, they change. The breakdown, what I see as an emerging breakdown between the younger population and, senior leaders of society in terms of, typically the elders in Africa, that means something. And in some societies, it continues to be so. But so elders, chiefs, the social structures that should offer protection to people, this was not a guarantee. And within those social structures were religious leaders. And religious leaders, you saw the tension, this misinformation that Vinicius was talking about, the denialism, or the idea that you saw those leaders, especially the religious ones, being more interested in getting their congregations back to church or to the mosque, when it was obvious that bringing them back was going to create, a health crisis. And I think you saw a more intelligent society this time that chose, and you began to see what they considered, which leaders they considered effective. And I think the social system has been was under test, serious test this time around. We're going to begin to see transformation there. So these questions are answered in different countries in different ways, but what underpinned it the most is that people were wise and made decisions by and large, and the younger population actually have been very, they have been very dynamic in the way they have responded to the social cultural context as well as the governance context. And we're going to begin to see some changes in due course in these areas. So they were important in some contexts, but not in others. When you look at Senegal, they were important. When you look at many parts of Nigeria, they were not necessarily important.
And Vinicius?
Yeah, I just to second what Funmi just said. I think when we talk about the region, it's quite plural, culturally speaking, not only on, let's say, ethnic cultures, but also in urban context, there are several cultures there. The cultures of people living in slums are quite different from other communities inside the big cities also, despite having a lot of interactions and intersections. We are not talking about a monoculture of Brazil or a monoculture of Peru. There are multiplicities on that, and that they play a role, of course. But there is another aspect very interesting to highlight here, is in the moment that these people, independent of their ethnic background, independent of their culture, when they start to see victims more and more growing in their communities, they understood that it should be another sort of response, that the response that were coming, or even traditional responses, like Funmi said, religious responses or traditional habits or practices, they were not enough. So we need to look in a different way here. So the population, especially young population, are looking and demanding for actions that would be more systemic and holistic and not simply culturally.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions here about the politicization of COVID-19. Were in either Africa or in Latin America, were there situations where supplies or support was withheld from certain groups? And obviously there is a politicization over the issue of vaccines in Brazil at the moment. Vinicius, can I come to you first on that one? Were there any instances of politicization around this?
It is quite a lot. The political arena in Brazil is hot. It's very, very hot regarding COVID. Just today, the Brazilian agents for public health, called Anvisa, it's like the FDA in the US, decided to not approve the Chinese vaccine in Brazil, to really stop the tests that were being carried on together with a Brazilian institute called the Butantan. And then the president said, well, I won another battle here. That's why the mayor of São Paulo said that he would buy those vaccines. And the Brazilian president don't want to allow the mayor of São Paulo have good position politically. So we are really in a battle, the political battle here. As I said in the beginning, there are quite an ideologization and politicization of this debate that's not good at all for address the situation that we are seeing in Brazil getting more severe year by year. So the possibility of this vaccine, that's a Chinese and Brazilian development together, it's interrupted now by the Brazilian agents that allows or not this sort of research. So we actually are setting back lots of resources, economical and also intellectual resources that have been in place because of a political game here. This is a quite dangerous movement.
And of course, President Bolsonaro is an anti-vaxxer, isn't he? So it's going to be an interesting situation to monitor.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I have, Funmi, any situations across Africa where there's been the politicization and particularly groups denied support deliberately as a political gesture?
Yes, actually almost across the board to varying degrees. You've heard, in fact, we had a couple of papers on Zimbabwe last month or a couple of months ago about the weaponization of COVID, which is suddenly that it's, when citizens are accusing political leaders of weaponizing it, in the ways in which they provide support, or even in the ways that people are targeted, say for not locking down and so on. And therefore you begin to see some, a measure of inequity in the way support is being provided, or in the kinds of accusations that are being made about people that are not being collaborative with the state. We have seen, although this was not, there's been the argument in Nigeria with the NSAS movement, with the protests that we saw in the last few weeks, that this was also partly resulting from COVID, the impact of COVID-19. More unemployed people, uncertainties created, particularly for young people, and police brutality around that. And that actually is an extension of some of the politicization of it, which gets out of hand in some cases, although the question of police brutality was there long before COVID, but these things have become more amplified. But suddenly in the middle of those protests, you saw warehouses where all of the food aid assistance packages that were meant to have been distributed to ordinary people, these things had been stored, and there were accusations varying from whether they were stored because they had not yet been released for delivery, or that they were being stored because some people anticipated that they could use those as political materials, give to people from their parties, or give to people as, during Christmas, all of the things that begin to go around, border on, again, patronage, a political patronage system. So there are many, many things that have emerged on this question of politicization.
I'm going to move on. We've got some interest in education. Now, you both talked about how educational inequalities have been amplified during lockdown and the COVID-19. Do you think that a focus on education in the developing world might be one of the emerging responses to COVID-19?
Yeah, can I?
Funmi, can you come first? Yes.
All right. I think there's a lot that is going on at the same time, and we need to dissect this a lot. So one is a question of access to education itself and who gets access to education. The second has to do really with the quality of the education, even that access to the quality of education. Third is curriculum. Fourth is resources from the state and how those resources have been distributed in the first instance. All of these things have suddenly been laid bare. And I don't think that we can paper over it and go back to business as usual. This is going to be a very strong area to look at. Even at King's, we have to think about the nature of our own partnerships and how we ensure that we do not reinforce existing inequalities as we partner with those societies.
Vinicius?
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add to what Funmi said, and we are really playing on the same score here. I just want to say that the COVID crisis and the pandemic triggered a revolution in what will be education for the time now and future, and that we need to make sure that this revolution that's happening now, this systemic revolution, this synthetic revolution in the education that we are seeing that started because of COVID pandemic will not reproduce historical inequalities and will not reproduce the historical inequalities because of education specifically. So yeah, there are thousands of resources on hand, thousands of technological resources, but we need seriously to discuss the pedagogies that will come from with these resources and how to make that democratically accessible for all the population and not just for those privileged that can buy and can have economically access to this sort of education.
Funmi, you mentioned earlier on the importance of, or the role that WHO had played in Africa as the sort of the international organization for pandemic. Did the WHO have a good pandemic in Africa? Was it a supportive environment? Was it listened to?
I think so. Yes, it's also very interesting. I think Tedros, that's the WHO director, has had support across the board in Africa anyway, being an African heading WHO at this point in time. But the WHO has not been controversial in Africa. They have generally followed the science and the pathways that have been laid by WHO. If there are any critiques at all, they've not been of WHO, but of the government and how they have adapted the patterns seen in Europe. So asking people to lock down who may not be able to afford to lock down without taking doing something to fundamentally shift the situation was going to be problematic in any case. And so the fact that those governments or those societies were not necessarily thinking about the Sweden scenario, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but to just simply say, maybe we will not take that path because of our unique circumstances. So I think the WHO in the end had been the one institution of global governance that seemed to be very present across the board, notwithstanding the controversy over the US and China, or the US's threatened withdrawal of support. I think that politically it's supported in Africa.
Thank you. We're just coming to the last couple of minutes, so I wondered if either of you had a last point you wanted to leave us with. So Vinicius, you first.
I would like to mention, just again, reinforcing this aspect of education. I think we have here a big challenge, but also a big responsibility looking at the future for the region. And I would say that not only Latin America and Brazil, but also Africa. And as King's College London, as an institution of education, with the reputation that we have this responsibility. And as director of Brazil Institute, I am totally dedicated to try to help to support this change that Brazil needs, and we can go and give some support and help as institution.
That's a really good point for us to finish on. Funmi, a last point?
No, thank you. I want to reinforce that what Vinicius has just said. As far as Africa is concerned, there's a lot that we don't know, but there's a rich environment for knowledge production, for a radical shift in the way that we engage. And I think King's is leading the pack with the sort of ideas that we've put on the table. We will end up diversifying, not just, we're already engaged in research, particularly the health faculties, and of course, parts of SSPP, Social Science and Public Policy, research in Africa is one part of it, but diversifying the ways in which we engage Africa so that we engage from a point of mutual benefit and transformation. I think that's the way of the future, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to both our speakers, Funmi Olonisakin and Vinicius Carvalho, for a really engaging and thought-provoking presentations from both of you. And there's a virtual round of applause going on in the background. Something Zoom hasn't learnt for us to do, but we need to add that as one of the facilities. And before I let the audience go, I just want to highlight the fact that next week on the 18th of November will be the KCLA address. It's happening on Zoom again. And this year's speaker will be King's President and Principal, Professor Sir Ed Byrne, and his topic is Kings of Today and Tomorrow, What a Great University Must Contribute to the Wider World, which is a really fitting subject after what we've just been hearing. Ed is going to be drawing on a recent book that he's published with former Secretary of Education Charles Clarke, and it's called The University Challenge, Changing Universities in a Changing World. And you should have received an email inviting you to sign up, but you can sign up at the King's KCLA page at King's. Also to point out to everybody that the series, the full 6 conversations will be available, we hope, later this month on YouTube. Everybody will get a link to the boxed set of presentations at a later stage this month. So thank you all for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I thought it was an excellent presentations from two of our King's experts. Thank you very much.